Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? No, really, who are we? And where do we come from? And where are we go? I don't know anymore. I used to know. But luckily, I'm joined today by amazing people who can talk to me about the answers to those questions and other questions. And in particular, we can talk about the latest Sustain event, which was held around 2 weeks ago by the recording clock. Around a month by it's out now and you're listening to this clock. Hello, our beautiful guests. And who are these people I'm talking about? They are the other co-hosts of this podcast. That's right. I'm joined today by Eriol Fox. Eriol, how are you doing?
Doing good.
Joined by Abby Cabunoc Mayes. Abby, how are you doing?
Great.
Leslie Hawthorn.
Hi there. Delighted to be here.
And Gunner.
Hey there. Also happy to be in the house.
Amazing. The band is almost all back together. Brief head tip and hat tip, whatever it is, to Justin and Eric and Lauren, wherever you are. So our goal today as host only of this podcast wasn't to sit here and ask questions to the giant abyss of what is open source software, but rather to talk about how did the event go. We held a 2-hour conversation on Thursday the 13th for most of you. And it was really exciting and we covered a lot of topics. Now, I am in New Zealand, which means it is 2 a.m. for me, so I am not coherent or cogent. But Gunner, I believe you facilitated the event and maybe you have more thoughts about what we actually talked about.
Sure. We spent a lot of time both taking stock of the current moment and I think also reflecting on how things have evolved since the SustainOSS project got launched. I guess that was way back 8 or so years ago. And we split our time between some interactive updates on a range of topics, some of them big picture and some of them very specific, from measuring the usage of open source software and running high impact individual donor programs to talking about how you can do free and open source software in countries that have import-export restrictions or other terrorist designations in the eyes of certain other countries. And once we'd done sort of a tour of the community that was present and some things that are on people's mind, we did deeper working sessions, things about understanding how AI is impacting and changing FOSS. We talked about revenue strategies. We talked about what does it look like to become CRA ready, knowing that could be very disruptive to both open source and open source communities. And we also talked about unseen FOSS infrastructure and a range of maintainer issues, trends, and being a maintainer. It was a good check-in. It was a good way to reconnect as a community. And we hope it'll provide a springboard to more collaboration and deeper exploration of the things that are both driving and adversely impacting sustainability in open source software today.
As always, Gunner is really good at talking about conversations that he facilitated, which is amazing. Now, this was a 2-hour event that happened way back on the 13th of March, which was exciting. And so in order to give a sort of a framework to this conversation that we're having here today, what I'm going to ask all of you hosts to do is think back all those 2 weeks ago. Think back under the waves of everything that's happened since. It's been a long year in the past 2 weeks. And what is one takeaway that you had from this event? One thing that you think was really awesome, the conversation was amazing, and you're glad that you were there for that. Gunner, I'm going to start with you.
I'm still wrestling. I had the privilege of being in the conversation on how AI is changing FOSS. And I feel like we have not yet begun to wrap our heads around how AI is and will continue to change FOSS, and in particular, its impact on the mythical sole contributor. It's not clear to me whether the sole contributor will mythically be able to leverage AI to do cool stuff, or whether it will marginalize the value of those sole contributors or make them less likely to be engaged by virtue of automation at scale, code generation, and that a bunch of other entry-level maintainer tasks are arguably addressed or mitigated by AI. So I feel like a lot more conversation is needed there.
Eriol, what was your main takeaway?
Well, I spent most of my time talking about the human life impact of open source, or in the sense of like, how do our lives and the things that we do, both inside open source and outside open source, impact the sustainability of open source? And so my main takeaway was that it's actually pretty hard to have those conversations without the space that an online collected event does or an in-person collected event does. And some of the magic of not just Sustain events, but other events are able to bring in, allowing people to really share some of their really deep and personal experiences in a way that they hope will help other people in their other projects. So the conversation I was having was around mentorship and succession planning.
I actually had a very similar takeaway for me. I helped to run the conversation, which we called it the non-burnout conversation, right? Like, how is open source influencing maintainers today without using burnout? Because we feel like that's been done to death, but also that's kind of the point of burnout in the first place. And the conversation was really interesting for me because being an open source maintainer today is really difficult in a way that it was still difficult 5 years ago. It was difficult 10 years ago. But what's harder now is that it doesn't take place in the vacuum of just, I just do my work and then this is the evenings and I'm tired of working my evenings. Now it's more like I need to move my entire email system away from the US to Europe, and I don't know how to do that on top of doing all this other stuff. Like, everything has to be couched within a geopolitical framework in order to just say, I'm exhausted. And that in itself is very exhausting. And so just having a space to talk about that with other maintainers was really useful for the people in the room I was in, including me. And so my takeaway is that just reaching out to other maintainers, to other practitioners of open source, to other lawyers of open source, there's so many different hats that we all wear, and talking about it's just really hard today to be enthused about this. I mean, maybe we're all just getting grayer. I mean, I don't know, but it just seems like it's useful to reach out and talk about it, because otherwise we're all just fighting our own personal little wars. So that was my takeaway. And it's actually a positive one because we did manage to talk about these things. But yeah, it was tough. Abby, haven't heard from you yet. What was your takeaway?
Yeah, and this wasn't the takeaway I was planning to share, but what you and Eriol just shared, it really hit home. I think just how needed these conversations are with AI, with these tighter budgets, with the burnout, with the graying of open source. I think we needed this conversation, and people were just so happy to have a space to talk about this and to really dig into these things. Yeah, that really struck me during the event. The takeaway I didn't mean to share was around the corporate funding for open source. That's mostly the spaces I was holding, and just how different the motivations are for funding, from goodwill to the community, some marketing budget, to securing your stack, to mitigating risk, and how tricky it is to know what kind of funding is which and how to really position your project to address these different needs. So that was a big takeaway for me, just how complex the corporate funding situation is. And I think we got to a place where we can start to tackle that and start to help projects across the board. And Leslie, I think you're last.
Well, I think my big takeaway here is that I missed a really great event, which I am deeply sad to report. But I can just echo a lot of the sentiments that have already been shared. And the thing that's really resonating for me is all of these discussions of sort of the human element in open source software development and the deep need we have as practitioners to be able to reach out to one another and rely on one another for support. And I think I would have heard it referred to in the past pejoratively as group therapy, because we definitely need a safe space to talk about all of these different topics, be they a personal impact to us in our daily work, or even just how do I continue to maintain my work as a practitioner, as there are so many different shifts in the geopolitical landscape, in motivations for corporate funding, et cetera. And while I may be a great open source citizen first, there's still a very different environment in which I am now operating. And I may have to kind of change my persona during my career day as necessary. And just being able to talk about how that is navigated effectively while still being true to yourself and your values. It's something we need more time and space to talk about.
I totally agree that we need to have a safe space to have these conversations, and it's difficult to do so. I've been really privileged to be on most of the Sustain podcast, and it's been interesting to be able to share over and over how open source impacts individual maintainers, how it impacts the world at large, and how we can use open source for the better. And just holding those things, holding those conversations on a weekly basis has enabled me to have this bird's eye lens. And the problem with having a landscape lens is you end up realizing there's parts of the landscape you just never get to. Like over there is the elephant graveyard. We don't talk about it as much as we would like. And so instead of asking what conversation we want to keep having going forward, which I think would be a normal conversation for a Sustain event, what I want to ask is what conversation did we not have that you think is really important, that you would like to talk about in the future, about sustaining open source. Was there anything that you feel like would be really good to talk about that we just didn't really get to, or that you saw a glimmer of during the event, but you didn't get to explore it in depth because it was only 2 hours and we live within a conceptual framework of time space that is finite?
I have a proposed topic, and yet I'm ashamed because I do not know whether it was discussed or not. A very important area that I know has been coming up for me, especially when we're talking about compliance with the Cyber Resilience Act and how that's impactful to open source projects and their maintainers, has been a need for greater collaboration between different software foundations as we are attempting to figure out what is our strategy as the overall open source community for being able to understand and be able to deal with the impact of different worldwide regulation as it pertains to open source software. I think we do a great job as individuals collaborating across various aisles and wearing our various hats, but I would love to see there be a better and more integrated way for all of the various software foundations who are all working in the same space to be able to, rather than divide and conquer, to unite and figure out a united message in response to these different changes on the legislative landscape.
I totally agree with that. That's actually pretty similar to mine, which is how do we think about the commons at large continually as a reframing for thinking about open source, and how do we ensure that it is maintained and kept? Now, I know that's kind of silly because that's kind of what we do here all the time, but it's not solved. It's just not even close to being anywhere near figured out in the terms of like, how do we protect open source at large? And no matter how much we quote Ostrom, or no matter how much we have Greg Bloom in the room, there's always more work to do. And so I would love to have more conversations about what does it mean that we're releasing this for the public good? And what does it mean that we have it as a shared resource that we need to figure out? How do we talk about succession planning for maintainers? We all need to retire at some point. We need to get new blood, please. Otherwise, we don't need to retire, right? So like, I'm trying to figure out like, how do we make this work? And I think there's more conversations to be had at that ideological level, which also meshes directly with legal stuff, directly with governments, directly with figuring out what happens with your GitHub repo. Those are the sort of questions I'm sort of thinking about. And that may be a word salad, but that's because there's just so much. There's just so much. Eriol, I see your hands up.
First, I will say I didn't get to have deep and nerdy conversations about specific things to do with design and open source, which is what I feel like most people expect of me now. But that likely is because FOSS Backstage Design was literally the day before the Sustain event. So I got to have a lot of really fantastic nerdy conversations about design and open source at that event, thanks to the FOSS Backstage folks. But I think the conversations, I think I'm basically going to reword what you both said in a slightly different way. I think the conversations that I felt like I wanted more of and still want more of is how the health and wellness of open source and the maintainers of open source progresses. I've been thinking a lot lately about how we share space and how we are kind to each other and how we tread softly and how we do no harm in the spaces in which we share, especially within the increasing competitiveness and stressful environment that is kind of being created on a global scale. How do we retain the knowledge that we're all trying to create better, more open, more free, more accessible, insert word here, for each other? And that doesn't mean that we take chunks out of each other and peck at each other and kind of critique harshly when maybe somebody tries something new. I think those conversations and managing that was something that I missed personally.
For me, a conversation that I've been having since the Sustain event, and Richard, your comment really reminded me of this, it was around succession planning and what to do after you die, essentially. Like what happens to your GitHub repo. And there is a feature I just learned about where you can specify successor, but other things like your trademarks for your open source project, your domain name, like what do you do with these things? My colleague, he's giving a talk, Fintan Ryan, he's giving a talk at Monkey Gra in a couple of days. So I got to watch a dry run. His talk's called The Bus Factor. And actually, I don't know if they're recording it. So I don't know if you can go watch it. But it was a talk all about this. And we had a great conversation afterwards. And then even in the Open Collective Discord, I was talking a little bit with Ruth Teasley about this as well. And I think it's such a big topic. And with the graying of open source, it is important to think about what would happen to your open source project should the worst happen. The other conversation I wish I could have sat in at least, and it did happen, but I wasn't part of it, was around AI and open source. I think this will have a big impact in our communities going forward. So I do think there's a lot of room to keep talking about that.
And I'm happy to take the baton from there. And first, building, Abby, on your comment, as someone who helped hold that space on AI, I think one of the most compelling things that, for instance, the Sustain community could be doing is mapping out the facets, mapping out the lenses that we sort of look through to consider the role of AI, the impact of AI, the effects that AI is having on free and open source software and communities, because that vocabulary doesn't exist yet. There's not a factoring or conceptualization or a framework. It's just AI and FOSS, and that is a blunt instrument of a frame. And so I think we really have some work to do to deconstruct that into more useful frames around labor, around code quality, around a lot of other aspects of the ways that AI is being integrated, leveraged, and otherwise used with or without the consent of those who maintain projects. For my own part, I would also say, I think globally and politically, and certainly in parts of the world I'm connected to, there's been just a real backlash against a lot of efforts around things on equity and inclusion and awareness about how power is held. And I feel like we didn't have that conversation. And I feel like I would be very upset if what is going on in the larger world precluded our ability to keep talking about how we are mindful of geography and gender and other forms of inclusion that historically have not been well addressed in free and open source communities, but more recently have at least been discussed. And I think there's a real responsibility on the part of Sustain to keep those conversations going.
I couldn't agree more. It's really hard for me to deal with that entire topic because I never know where to go next. It's like, yes, it's difficult. And yes, we need to solve it. And yes, the AI topic too. Like, it's great that we have easier ways to Google things now that Google is horrible, but it's really hard to figure out, like, how do we not use these tools and how do we code better collectively and how do we respect each other collectively and how do we do so without depending upon the EU to pass good legislation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's more work to do. I wouldn't say that we have solved everything in the past 10 years, which makes me feel like I've failed, but I think that's just me being ridiculous. So there's always more, which is great. One of the exciting things about Sustain is that it's basically a community of volunteers. None of us are paid to do this work. We all showed up in our free time. Leslie showed up in her free spirit. And it's very exciting to know that we were able to have a conversation, 75 people in the room, talking about what is open source and how do we deal with it. So, Gunnar, tell us about the next event. Do we have a plan for that?
I think we came out of the virtual forum with some very clear ideas on some next conversations. I think there's a lot of talk about the degree to which a AI-focused forum where we really try to unpack those facets and try to invite in a lot more people that are doing a lot of the innovation, the experimenting, and the threat modeling around AI. There's a real interest and a real heat around that. I'd look to my other fellow podcast guests for other through lines you'd like to see continued at next forums.
I would love to talk about the interplay of digital sovereignty and open source because we're seeing a lot of talk right now that sovereignty is important, but sovereignty also is kind of orthogonal to open source, right? Saying, hey, we're going to have this for our country and it's going to be all open source in our country is like, well, the whole point of it is that anyone can use it anywhere. And so trying to balance, hey, we're going to have this and we're going to have that is a conversation that I think is really important that needs to be talked about, particularly as everyone is right now migrating their infrastructure outside of America. And so it'd be really good to have that conversation now because there's so many maintainers I know who are having to do that work and it's exhausting and hard and lonely. And so that's why conversations are important. I actually don't think we have time to hop around the room and have everyone say, and besides, we already did just talk about conversations we'd like to have going forward. Again, there's always more room. Watch this space. But for now, I'm just really grateful that all of us managed to come together, talk about what happened, and also that we had this conversation in the first place. So Eriol, Abby, Leslie, Gunnar, it's been great talking to you. I hope that we have more of these in the future. And thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts and words under one sentence? Give me one sentence each.
I'll just throw out gratitude for the Sustain community and the people that have been with us all along the way and the newer joiners.
I was going to say almost the same thing. I'm just so grateful for you all and glad that we have a space for these conversations.
In addition to gratitude for the community at large, I just want to give a shout out to the fine folks who are organizing United Nations Open Source Week. and looking forward to the conversations that come out of that about uniting as a global commons and a global community and support open source software, making tools available to everyone who needs to make use of them.
And my gratitude is going to be specifically towards Jonah Duckles, who put together from the succession planning conversation a list of 10 simple rules for succession planning, which I hope to make open source soon.
And my main takeaway and thought is that not just Jonah, but there are so many individual voices who are having this conversation right now, who are sharing awesome resources, who are doing things. And I want to continue to lift them up in any way that we can, which also depends upon you, listeners. If you feel like there's someone who ought to be on this podcast, hit us up. If you feel like there's some resource that you want to share, throw it on the discourse. If you feel like there's a conversation that we can have, you can always hashtag it Sustain on Mastodon. It's been really exciting to be able to get these people in a room, and I'm hoping that we can do it in the future. If you enjoyed this conversation and you have more conversations that you feel like are awesome and that you want to have, there are things you can do now, listeners. You can go to discourse at SustainOSS.org and talk on our discourse and share awesome things with other people. If you go to podcast at SustainOSS.org, you can find all of these podcasts that we've had. We've had 350 of them now, 400 if you count open source design. Please share them. Some of them are evergreen and super, super awesome. We also have a Mastodon, we have a LinkedIn, and we have a Blue Sky, so you can always talk to us there. You can always email the host of this podcast by emailing podcast@SustainOSS.org. And finally, and I cannot emphasize this enough, you can donate to make sure that we have the means to pay our awesome editor for this podcast and do other amazing things. Go to opencollective.com/SustainOSS and click that donate button. That would be really, really awesome. So finally, thank you all so much. Have a good day. Keep the Sustain fight going. See you soon.